That's my existence, man. All right. So, the hacking intro. We're just going to talk broadly about the concepts. Is this a metaphor? I don't know. What's a metaphor? I don't understand metaphors. We're going to do here. We're just going to talk broadly about hacking, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts over the next, week or so, couple weeks actually. So one thing I wanted to point out was, sorry, apparently I can't scratch my shoulder and talk at the same time, or think for that matter. I wanted to kind of point out here that I password protected some zip files, and I also have some encrypted HC files, okay, using VeraCrypt. Now, going forward, I'm going to move over to encrypted zip because I was using the HC files just to prevent antivirus from being able to scan things, but Zip does it just as well, and the tools are a little simpler. I don't know about just as well, but it does it well enough for my purposes. So, I'll be migrating over to password protected zip files over time, but you might encounter one or the other. If you encounter either of those, if there's a password that you're asked for, that's probably because it's something which should not be on your home system. Okay. In other words, AV is going to detect it and it's going to blow it away. So the idea here is that we download those directly to our forensic workstations in order to use them, or whatever other virtual machine we're using it on. Okay. Now, the convention that I've adopted is that whatever the file name is, that's the password to get into it. Okay. All I'm trying to do is stop the AV from messing around with things. So if you get, like, for example, mimikatz.hc, you can extract that just by taking mimikatz as the password. Okay. Case sensitive. So if it's all lowercase, then just keep it lowercase. If there's an uppercase in there, you should probably preserve that uppercase as well. Okay. Just a heads up, that's kind of going forward. There are some exceptions to that, but when there are exceptions, I usually put that in a document somewhere, like it'll be in an exercise. Okay, but this is the default behavior. So like I said, today we're just going to do the hacking intro. This is a fun part of the course because there's a lot of bang for your buck without too much intellectual processing going on here. The other ones break your brain a little bit more. This one is just kind of, you get to break other things, right? Not your own brain. So I think you'll enjoy this first month. And then it's going to get a little bit harder. You'll get a little more stressed, maybe because of other courses. And you'll be like, do I really have to do this? Do I have to think this hard? And I'm still going to make you do that. So, but for now, just kind of sit back and enjoy and play around with things. Okay. So we got a couple exercises. The Kali exercise is just setting up and customizing the Kali VM for your purposes, making sure that it's unique for things like screenshots. Um, and then Metasploit with Armitage is just a very brief intro to a GUI interface for Metasploit, which is a bit of a crutch. I know some people really like it, but really, if you're going to use Metasploit, eventually you need to get into the command line pretty seriously. But Armitage is a nice interface you can slap on top of it. Okay, so we'll get to that in a sec, but for now we're just doing the hacking intro. Does anybody have any questions before I dive in? I'll just take a coffee swig while you're thinking about it. Okay, let's do this from the beginning. Just make sure I can see everybody if they have a question. So I don't mind if you pop in a question in the chat. That's not something that bothers me. I don't mind being interrupted. It's more like I have trouble noticing. Like once I'm kind of, I'm in the zone, it might take me a couple of minutes to notice that you've asked a question. But do feel free, okay? And I'll happily kind of stop the lecture, just address that particular question, and then move on. Just be aware. Sometimes I'm kind of, off in my own little ether there talking about something. Okay, so uh, hacking. Historically, the term, these days it's got a negative leaning to it, a negative bent. But historically, that really wasn't what it was meant to be. Okay, so the original term came within the community itself of essentially people who were curious about computer systems. It's what you might call a geek these days. Geek comes from the Carney history, carnival history. We use that these days in the less negative sense that hacker used to be used for. Okay. Essentially, it's just someone who's very skilled at working with computer systems. They're very interested in how they function, and they have good insights into subtle details about it that they can take advantage of. Okay. So that means that they've spent a lot of time working on it, and they understand it better than most others. Now, this came out of the universities and MIT, um, artificial intelligence, but also telecommunications. Okay, so real hacking in the early days really started with the telephone systems before we had an internet. So you may have heard, I think it was Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. They actually sold little kits on the side that you could. It's like a little whistle that they would sell that was customized so that you could make free calls on the telephone system at the time. You created an appropriate level of noise that the system interpreted it as the right to make a long distance call. Okay, it was just, and that's essentially hacking the system. They figured out how the system operated, what it needed to do certain things, and then they were able to simulate that in order to gain access to resources for free. Okay, this obviously annoyed the telephone operators, right? But that same spirit kind of carried over into the computer age. Okay, so they're annoying. It's a bit of a nuisance to, authorities and businesses, and so they've developed over time a bit of a bad reputation for this. But some people would take it a certain distance, and that was it, and other people continued to take that on into deeply illegal territory, right? And so hacking became associated with some pretty negative activities. Now, the people who have a long history in the hacker community, they advocate that those people should be termed crackers. That's never going to happen. The association is too deep in the culture right now. So right now, you could be an ethical hacker. That's like a little adjustment, but generally hacking is seen as an illegal and negative thing. Okay. But there have been attempts to rehabilitate it, and ethical hacking is one of those because it's recognized that it serves a good purpose when it's used in an appropriate way, right? So the ethical hacker is really someone who has those same skill sets. Sometimes maybe a little bit less because they can't cross certain lines, right? But what they do get is they only act when they have explicit permission. So typically they will charge for their services. They will attempt to hack into your system, uh, and then they'll produce a report about what they were able to do, what they weren't able to do, and what kind of recommendations they might have for how you could fix any kind of issues they noticed. Okay. Their motivations are very similar to black hat hackers. In fact, many of them started out as when they were young as black hats and then kind of matured into ethical hacking. Okay. So, it's kind of the kids being kids thing, um, up to a point, right? So it is, there are some who uh, they had a bad enough history that some people don't really want to work with them. And then other people in the community don't really draw a distinction, you know. But basically, they're looking for the intellectual challenge. They like increasing security for clients, right? Or even just for themselves. But really, I mean, money comes into it in the end. Like a lot of people are hoping to make a career out of it, something that they find interesting and enjoyable. So the key difference being that they do operate with permission. Usually, it should be in the form of a contract, right? Where you say, "Look, I'm gonna try and hack into your organization. These are the limits that we'll agree to. So this is what I will do, and this is what I won't do, without getting into too many specifics. But I'm not going to cause any severe damage. Basically, you might even say, once I get into your, inside your network, that's where I'll stop, for example. Or once I've owned a single machine, that's where I'll stop. Like you can actually set the limits, right, in the contract itself. Now, ethical hacking steps and black hat steps, or just regular hacking steps, they're pretty much the same thing. Okay. The only difference is in reporting. Uh, where with ethical hacking, your report is your final deliverable, and that's quite important. That's really the purpose of it in the first place. Uh, with classic hacking, they're either going to stay resident in your network and just, keep doing bad things, or else, they may report in their own way just by kind of, sabotaging your web page to show that they succeeded in hacking you. That's not quite the same type of reporting, right? But otherwise, the concepts are really the same. So you start out with a reconnaissance, which is a bit more of a passive approach to gathering information. You get into scanning, which is a more active approach. Once you've gathered all this information from these two, trying not to be detected, you then want to formulate some way to gain access, get a foothold into the network, onto a system, and then you want to elevate privileges to the point where you can arrange so that you can maintain access yourself. Okay, so that you're no longer dependent on the way that you got in. You can come back anytime you like, right? And once you've gotten to that point, then you want to clear up your tracks. You might be doing the clearing of the tracks all the way through a little bit, but you want to go back and make sure that all the furniture is in the right place. Nothing looks odd to anybody. And that, my friend, is a metaphor. Okay. But you want to clean up, essentially, right? Sometimes hackers, when they find an exploit that will get them in and they're able to maintain access, they'll actually close the hole that they used to get in the first place because they don't want anybody else to use it, right? That's not really for your benefit. That's just for their own purposes. But that does happen sometimes. So clear the tracks, make sure that people can't tell that you've been there or that you're still there, right? So, when you have the StarWinds, uh, what is it called? A supply chain hack that occurred. Um, there were government operatives, probably from Russia, I think it was. I don't know if it was Russia or China. I think it was Russia. But they were squatting in people's networks for like 6 months or more, right? So sometimes they're just going to sit there and watch and pick up whatever they can. Other times they will kind of have, a spectacular, ta-da, look what I did. But for an ethical hacker, this is where you're actually going to say, okay, these are all the things that I did. So you detail all the tasks, all the steps in the process. You say, these were the weaknesses, and this is what I suggest that you do to fix them. Okay. Now, Sammy's actually he doesn't do ethical hacking per se, but he would make recommendations and reports about security back in back in his days at Grant McEwen, say, and before that. But one of the one of kind of the sad cases of ethical hacking and other security roles is that you go to a lot of effort. You tell people, look at all these problems. This is how you can fix them, and then they don't fix them. Okay, so that can be a little discouraging for people. Sometimes be aware that that's a phenomenon that exists in the environment. For some managers, having security measures in place is more about checkboxes than it is about actually securing the environment. And, bad habits can form. So there's a bit of a Cassandra issue with like you're kind of warning people, and then they don't take the measures until something bad happens. Then they look back and you're like, see, I told you so. I said so right here and right here and right here. Um, but it's too late, and often uh, that's when the finger pointing starts. So you got to be a little careful about that kind of thing. Politics can creep into all of this stuff. But if you enjoy this process, then it's something that could be an interesting career for you. Now, getting into reconnaissance. So just to briefly describe what it is. Here you're using essentially openly available information to gather uh, facts and details about the organization that you're trying to hack. That could be just visiting their webpage. It could be probing their DNS for information. Okay. And there are some interesting things that you can get, but you're doing it in ways that everybody else is doing anyways. Okay. You're not doing like unusual active scans of entire networks or anything like that. Uh, you're just doing kind of simple querying. Okay, and seeing what you can get out of that. And you'd be surprised. There's a lot of openly available information that can give you more details than you would have expected. Okay. So scanning tools can come into it, but you would be using them in a kind of a careful way to make sure that there's some plausible deniability on your part. So you're not like actively scanning a single system heavily or anything like that. Network sniffers, again, you'd want to be careful with that. But if you can get on site, you might be able to pick up some interesting things. Um, and then dumpster diving, which has been a thing for a long time and has been bringing the hackers and the homeless together for decades. When you're dumpster diving, you're looking for hardware that's just been thrown out, for example, and hasn't been properly cleansed or sanitized. Uh, and anything like even documents that might contain passwords, right? Even stickies, like little sticky notes, which people will often do. They'll just write something down, then they'll toss it out thinking nobody's going to notice it. So people do engage in dumpster diving to get information. A very nice source of information is actually printers, because nobody really thinks about them too much. I wouldn't grab stickies from a dumpster. Well, you, my friend, are not suitable for this profession then. You can't handle the dumpster diving. I'm not saying it's a macho thing, but no, it's yeah, like I wouldn't either. But when you're getting into hardware, um, printers often have hard drives associated with them, and they actually do store a lot of the jobs that you had printed already, and they haven't been wiped from the disk, right? It's just one of those little weak spots that organizations don't often think about, you know? So even if you can get like say Government of Alberta surplus, right? Uh, they'll wipe out their hard drives on their systems, but they won't wipe out the hard drives on the printers, right? And so if you can pull apart a printer, grab that hard drive, there may be a whole load of different print jobs which have been completed, but are still resident on the hard disk, even if they've been deleted. They're still there as data that can be recovered. Okay. So that's kind of what reconnaissance is. It's doing things that you're unlikely to get caught for, like going down to government surplus and getting a printer. That's not going to trigger any alerts, really. No one's going to think about that. Dumpster diving, well, I mean, if they catch you in there, you'll have to pretend you're homeless or something. But beyond that, it won't trigger a lot in terms of suspicion, right? Okay, so moving on to the next stage there, scanning. This is more intense, more potentially noticeable. So you're probably doing this from the comfort of your office or wherever you are, maybe maybe a cafe or a library or something like that. Um, Now, you can do kind of stealthy scanning or you can do very messy scanning. And, there are tools now that will detect whether someone's scanning your environment. So this is not a binary thing where you're either doing it or you're not. You can do it well and carefully, or you can do it kind of quick and dirty and fast, right? Quick and dirty and fast means you're more likely to be noticed, essentially. So what are we looking for? Well, here we're talking about networks, TCP, UDP packets connecting to services to see what's out there in the network. Okay. So typically we're talking about something like Nmap, Nessus, tools like that, right? Um, to give you an idea of what services is the organization running, what particular versions and what instances of the services. So IIS versus Apache, which version are they at? You know, all that information you can gather up and you can look at it and say, okay, well, if they're on this version of Apache, what are the bugs associated with it? What kind of security flaws are there? You can then look those up and you can decide whether that's a promising place to try and leverage. Okay. So, you might start out with a ping sweep that could be noticed though, so you might want to be more careful than that. You might do some trace routing just to figure out what the network layout is like. So, where are the routers? What are the different networks? How do they connect to each other? Right? All that fun stuff. Uh, Now, acquiring a more detailed information based on the data obtained during reconnaissance like this is kind of the next step where it's like, okay, I know they had a DNS server facing outwardly. They probably have some inwardly. Let's start figuring those out and how they connect to each other. Um, a really interesting thing in one class, I was teaching a based ethical hacking class when John Zabiak was away on a government contract. He was just doing some professional development. It was actually at the courts. I think he was doing all the reporting about recommendations. They ended up not really doing much of it. So that's a good example where sometimes you can feel like the work is done in vain. But he was off doing that, and in class, I was kind of coming up with some of my own assignments, and so I gave them a task to scan a few schools and come up with information about them, right? And one team discovered that Grant McEwen actually had a DNS server out on the internet, which provided information about all of the internal machines, okay? Which is a big no-no, really. And so like I was a little flabbergasted that they actually found something like that. I wasn't expecting that really. It's a bit of a no-no there. So they were kind of like, should we tell them? And I was like, no, don't tell them. Let them figure it out themselves. Just because I didn't want the students to get into any trouble for any of the work that they were doing. Because sometimes this information is not welcome, right? So scanning for vulnerabilities, like I said, Nessus, scanning for shares that may be poorly secured. So maybe there's not sufficient security put in place, permissions, for example. Banner grabbing to figure out what version of particular services are out there. That's very useful. This is all kind of the stuff that you did in threat analysis, right? Now, then you get to gaining access, which is not something that you did in threat analysis. So here once you figure out what services are running, you figure out what patch level they're at, things like that. Then you can make an evaluation about where you want to attack. Now, if you're doing it very carefully, you're actually going to research all of these, figure out what seems like a sure bet or a good bet, and then try those. Not just kind of throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. Now, in this course, at least initially, we're going to throw stuff against the wall to see what sticks, just because it's kind of fun. And this is just getting used to the tools. Later on, in a couple of classes, we'll move on to a bit more targeted approaches to hacking in, where you're thinking about it a bit more, and you're not just relying on the tools to try anything that works. You know. And that's what gaining access is about, is, once you've got access, even a little bit, like just as an account, like say, the Apache Triple W account, which doesn't have a lot of rights. If you can get that foothold, your next step is to try and leverage that to get more access. Okay. So ideally, you want to get root on your system, or you want to get administrator on your system, and even go to domain admin if you can. You know, um, that takes a little bit of time, but that's all part of gaining access. Once you've gained that access, then you want to maintain it. So once you have administrative rights, either on a system or in the environment in general, you want to be able to come back anytime you want. Okay. So that could mean you're going to download password files and decrypt passwords so you have multiple avenues for getting back in, installing rootkits and keyloggers, remote access tools, right? All of those are ways for you to be able to, kind of like, kind of make it hard for them to dislodge you, essentially. Now, covering your tracks is an important part if you don't want to go to jail, especially if it's illegal. But if it's ethical hacking, you're covering your tracks just to show how that can be done. Okay. So you would still, like in your report, you would kind of detail what you did with all of that. Okay. How you kind of covered up and patched up any damage that you might have caused along the way, so that they can go back, analyze it, and see how they could have noticed it in the first place. Right. Which is something you might suggest as well. And then reporting, which is where all the suggestions would lie, right? So identifying the vulnerabilities so that they can be fixed, and that could be technical vulnerabilities, but it could be procedural vulnerabilities as well. Okay, I'll give you an example at Nate. One thing which we always knew was an issue at Nate was any student, anybody, any random Joe could connect to the Nate portal and create an account for themselves, whether they were a student or not. Okay. Now, that doesn't sound terrible, except that this actually created an account in Active Directory for them. And once they have an account in Active Directory, you can scan all sorts of stuff in the environment, right? So I used to teach how you could do that to leverage further access within Nate, but I didn't want to give away too many details because, it's operational. But eventually they did, I heard the leadership talking about it. They were aware of it. I remember one of them saying my dog could make an account here at Nate, and they actually fixed it up, and now it's a lot better. Okay, but those kind of issues are what you want to report on and make suggestions about. So many ethical hackers, if you're being paid to do it, they're expecting a report. Some ethical hackers, they're looking for bounties. Okay, so they're not being asked to do something. They're just studying something and they're hoping that they get a reward for it. Often that is not met with positive results. Okay, the culture on that is changing a little bit. So Microsoft and Apple, they actually do offer bounties for bugs, where if you find something and it's significant, they'll pay you money for it, okay, as a thank you. Um, but it's a culture thing. So that's not always in place, especially with smaller companies or ones that aren't as ginormous as Microsoft or Apple and aren't necessarily focused on computer security because they want to be secure. Many other organizations, like say a car manufacturer, they're not going to put out bounties. They're just going to get really mad at you for trying to hack into their system, right? So from an ethical hacking perspective, that's not necessarily a way that works very well. But bounties can still be useful. If somebody's put out a bounty, then it's something that you could chase, get a reputation for, which can then allow you to get clients, right? So if the company has a vulnerability disclosure policy and they have formal channels for flagging vulnerabilities, that's a good thing, okay? Not all of them do. Alerting at-risk companies using emailing other means to employees. Often this goes into the bin bucket. Nobody ever really replies to you. That's a common issue, right? And that's where I'm talking about the Cassandra system. So if you're not known to the company, if they haven't hired you because they're actively looking, you may be dealing with a lot of either being ignored or kind of negative responses. Okay, some tools we're going to be using. Nmap is going to come into it quite a bit, just to gather information. There is a GUI version of Nmap. It's called ZenMap. I don't really focus on it because the GUI tools don't tend to integrate well with Metasploit. Okay. It is included with Kali, and it is a good way to kind of learn the command line switches for Nmap. But beyond that, I don't, and it's good for report generation actually. So if you want to produce a bit of a nice report, you can use ZenMap. And so, for example, you type in the target, you say, I want to do a quick scan, and it'll show you what the command line switches are. Okay, which is really kind of nice. It's a good way to learn it. Once you've learned it, it's not really. Then I would start switching over to just using the command line tool, or just go straight into the command line tool. You will get used to it eventually, right? Now, here's an example of what ZenMap can do in terms of giving you a sense. These are like router hops, essentially, right? Giving you a sense of your environment, how it's laid out, gives a nice visual. That's kind of what the business people like, you know? And it can be helpful for us to just kind of visualize things. So that's a nice thing to throw into a report. But the non-visual data can actually be imported into Metasploit for use, which is very handy. Okay, so this is more for human eyeballs. The command line tools can actually produce data as well, which can then be fed into scripts, which you can use to run against and try various exploits. Okay. Now, Metasploit, I've mentioned it already a little bit. This is they call it a framework. Essentially, it's a way of bringing together various tools and scripts in order to do pen testing, okay, penetration testing. So it is kind of complex, uh, but it doesn't take too long to get your head around the basics of it, which that's about as far as we're going to go, you know. You'll be able to kind of walk around the neighborhood essentially, but we're not taking the bus, let's say. So this is often used in conjunction with Nmap and Wireshark to test vulnerabilities and to try and break into remote systems. Uh, this number is constantly changing. So there are way more than 1,677 exploits now. There's probably more than 495 payloads. But what's happened with Metasploit is basically you have exploits falling off the rolls over time. So whatever they think is most relevant, they will package in to their distribution. You can add other ones if you want to, and they do age out after a while. So, if an exploit is not very frequently used anymore because it's not likely to be out there in the wild, you may lose access to it, and then you might have to go and import it again. Okay. That's so I've seen that in this class where certain hacks just kind of disappear over time, and then you have to go and find a different one or fish that one out from the back room essentially. Now, there are different types of payloads. A payload is just what you're trying to get executed on the remote system, right? You're looking to get a shell of some type. So by a shell, I mean PowerShell, command line, command.exe, bash shell, something like that, where you can interact with the system and issue it commands, right? Um, so your payload will try and create a shell that can be sent back to you to interact with over the network. So it allows you to run scripts or commands. You might be using the default operating system. You might be able to upload uh, your own tools and then use those. Classic command line is very common. Meterpreter shell is something that's built into Metasploit. So this is kind of a custom thing. The nice thing with Meterpreter is that it runs resident in RAM only. Okay, it's not occupying any space on the disk, and so if I was doing classic forensics against a hack where somebody had gotten in with a Meterpreter shell, and I pull the plug to take an image of it, there won't be any there won't be any evidence really because it's just been running in RAM the whole time. Okay. That's not true so much with the command line shell where you can actually, there are artifacts which are left behind. The interpreter shell, on the other hand, it has a lot of little features that are a bit more hack based. So you can take screenshots. Um, you can use it to try and access uh, hashes associated with passwords, things like that. You can actually cause the mouse to misbehave. There are some fun little bits in it, but it's also a bit more geared towards accessing content from a system. But there are other payloads that you can include as well, and even variations of these ones. Okay, where you need a specific configuration because the firewall is blocking your ability to exfiltrate or get messages out from the network that you're trying to hack into. That's why they have so many different types of payloads. Yeah. Okay, so Metasploit is often used with Armitage, which is a front-end GUI on top of it. Not always used with it. So it really depends on the person. The Metasploit project itself, the people who are behind it, they don't, they, you're free to use Armitage, but if you ever need support from them, let's say you're professional, you've bought the professional version, you've got a support contract with them. If you're asking for support using Armitage, they'll be like, no, you got to use the Metasploit framework command line console. Okay. So their expectation, they're not supporting third party essentially, right? So some people really like Armitage. To me, it's getting a little long in the tooth. And I actually just like the command line tools myself. We're going to start out with Armitage just for nonsense play, basically. And you may decide that you like it because everything that you can do in the command line, Armitage will let you do sometimes through the GUI, sometimes by dropping down into a command line itself. Okay. So some people just like it as kind of their comfort. It's kind of like what's your favorite text editor, right? They like being able to do everything through Armitage. That's not really me, but you'll kind of develop your own taste for that as you go through this. All of this is included with Kali Linux. It's our Linux distro. There are other ones out there that you can use. There's Parrot, for example, which is a good one. But I keep it to Kali because it's still kind of considered to be the go-to standard. Okay. So we'll be using that. If you want to try something else, I have no objection to that, really. So long as you've got the Metasploit framework and you're able to work with it, I really don't mind. But I'm going to present Kali, and then you can kind of decide that could be your fallback or your main go-to. Okay. Feel free to do what you like, though. Now, John the Ripper, that's a hacking tool that's also bundled with Kali, this Linux distro, which has a whole bunch of hacking tools associated with it. This is not part of the Metasploit framework, but it is a useful side tool, and it's quite a popular hacking tool. Very old. It's been around for a long time, but it's maintained. Okay. There's a free version and a pro paid version for more advanced purposes. I always go free, and that's never been a problem from my perspective. Uh, if there's any kind of problem with John the Ripper, it's that there's so many options that you can kind of get lost in those options. Okay, so um, we'll do a little bit of password cracking just to kind of illustrate how these things can work. But it can get pretty esoteric after a while if you can go into a deep dive with John the Ripper. There are plenty of other tools too. There's Hashcat. That's a very good password cracker. I moved us away from Hashcat at one point because we used to use that because one of the advertised benefits of Hashcat was they would leverage your GPU to speed up hacking. And I didn't really care because we're not doing, massive hacks that need a lot of time and have to be really super efficient. But at one point, they forced you to use the GPU, and in a virtual machine, that's not such a good thing, right? So I switched us over to John the Ripper. It's a little more classic, but it also, and it has its own complications, but it's more predictable in that sense. So I used to have a Hashcat exercise. Now I've just gone back to John the Ripper. Uh, they can run on multiple OS platforms. That doesn't matter to us too much. The Pro version we're not going to get into too much, but there's a few things to be aware of. One is John the Ripper will often crack passwords and stick them into a file. And so it might look like it's running and doing nothing when actually it's just putting all the data into a file. Okay. You got to watch out for that. You can tell it to alert you every time it's got a password that it's cracked. But if you haven't provided those switches to do that, then it may not warn you. Okay. This is included with Kali Linux. It's a pretty good go-to. LoftCrack you've used before, I think in CMIS 1014, if you remember back that far. And if you haven't blocked it out of your memory. But we're not really going to work with it in this class. I'm just kind of mentioning it because it's a legitimate alternative, right? Now, there are other types of password cracking that we're going to use, like rainbow tables. We'll come to that later, but it's basically you do a lot of legwork up front to pre-compute hashes in order to make your hacks more efficient when you're actually doing them. Okay. Now, this takes a huge amount of storage and a lot of time to set this up. So hackers will often collaborate on these things, and you can actually download these large databases of pre-computed hashes to try and figure out passwords, right? Uh, it can be very useful and very effective, but there are also tools to help. There are methods you could take which can help defend against that. Okay, so you could use these, and we will play with these a little bit. And you can even install them on a live CD or USB. Uh, but it's not always the best solution either. We'll talk about that later. Kali Linux itself, this is derived from Debian. So it's actually derived from Ubuntu, but Ubuntu is derived from Debian. Okay, so this is a downstream distro which has taken all the work that other people have done, and then they're packaging their own way of doing it beyond that. Okay, so if you're used to Ubuntu, then you'll be pretty comfortable with the underlying structure of Kali. Basically, that's the idea. Okay. Now I've downloaded a VM and I've just zipped it up. Okay, I used to do an ISO install for people, and I found we were wasting time with people just having trouble doing the installation. I'm like, why are we wasting our time? Let's just get the VM. So now we're just downloading the VM, or I download it, I make it available. The one that I make available is no different from the one that's currently up there on on the Kali download site. So we have the 2024, I think it's the February version. That's the last one that they released. I also have a 2023 up on SharePoint, and I do that just in case. I always keep one release behind available just in case something breaks, because these guys are a little bleeding edge. It's not like Ubuntu where what you see is what you get for 5 years. Every time they release something new, there are things that have changed that may blow up an assignment or something like that. So I've got 2023 there if you want to use that, but 2024 is also available for use. Okay. This is free to download, but if you want support, you got to pay for it. Okay. So they're not exactly, they're not going to jump all over helping you with something if you can't figure it out, if you haven't paid them for a support contract. Now, this is used for hacking and pen testing, network security assessments. It's not the only game in town, but it is one of the more respected ones, probably the most popular one still. Most tools open in a command line prompt, so there's a lot of command line stuff that you're going to be doing here, even if you prefer a graphical user interface. it's still gonna, a lot of the stuff's still gonna have to be command line. This is what it looks like broadly. This is a bit of an older instance of it. But what you'll find is that, in the applications section, they've divided things up very nicely for you based on what it is you're likely to need. So there's a section for forensics, which is distinct from password attack. Okay. And under password attack, they'll have a whole bunch of tools. They may not be identical to this now because this is pretty old. Um, but what you might find is that there will be entries in password attacks which will be duplicated in forensics or some other area, wireless attacks, let's say. So there is some duplication. All they're really doing is coming up with categories of activities that you're likely to engage in, and then they just have soft links which will allow you to get to those rather rapidly. Okay. If you're in doubt, there's always a search option, so you can just type for what you're looking for, and it'll just pop up, and you can just click on it. Okay, and that works rather than navigating through the hierarchy tree. Okay, now in our exercises, we're not really using ISOs right now. We're pretty much working with VMs. I've got them up on SharePoint for you to use. So let me just switch over to that. No, that's not what I want. What do I want? I want... not that, this. Okay. So if you go in, this is the 2509 computer forensics, right? I do have a VM section, and that's got some Kali stuff in it. It's mostly got older stuff, to be honest. The forensic workstation, that's there. But actually, I have, because there's quite a few hacking VMs, I've placed them all here, okay, in their own folder. So right now, the one you really want to grab is Metasploitable 2. And this is not too big of a download. I think it's about a gig, maybe. Yeah, a little bit less than a gig. So from home, hopefully that'll be a smoother experience. In the next couple of weeks, things should speed up pretty well. But you want to grab that because we're going to make use of it. And you also need that Kali VM that I've made available, right? I think that is just under VMs, right? So that there's 2024 and 2023. Either or, I would say. If you're having a problem with the 2024 one, try using 2023 because we used it in the last two courses and seemed to be okay, right? Let's see what else. I think that's about it for now. Under hacking, eventually you're going to want each of these. So you don't need them right now today, but I would say you want to drag them down sooner rather than later because you know how long it can take sometimes, right? Okay, so all of those tools under the hacking folder, all of those VMs, they're all just practice or in preparation for the lab. Okay, so the lab is going to be different VMs, but if you don't get the practice, it's definitely going to slow you down in the lab. This is a chance to kind of just mess up, break things, do things wrong, learn your lesson from it, and then when we get to the lab, you'll be a little more prepared. Okay. You're not being evaluated for anything until you get to the lab. So if you look at an assignment and it's like just frustrating the heck out of you, uh, there's nothing that says you have to do it. It's just that eventually I do base my labs heavily upon the exercises. So they are meant to be preparation for the lab. Okay. Now, one more thing I want to mention is the lab itself is based on group work. 2 to 3 people for this first lab. So you want teams of 2 or 3. If you want a group of 4, I would generally just suggest you split down to a group of 2. Okay. When we get to the point where there's somebody who has no team to join, then I'll either add you to a group of 2 or I'll shave off a group of three in order to make that work. I'd rather not do that. So I'd like you to self-select as much as you can right now. So start working on figuring out who your team is going to be. Okay. Two is enough to get this working. Three, I feel, is the ideal. Okay. Any questions on any of that so far? And then I'll just point you to the exercises after. Okay. So first thing I'd want you to do in terms of exercises, if you haven't done, uh, last week's exercise or the previous class's exercise, sorry, uh, then I would suggest you do that first. Okay. After that, you want to do the Kali exercise, which is just download the Kali VM and customize it essentially so I can tell who you are. Okay. This is not a very long one, so this is very brief. It's only the download that would take you some time. Okay. The second one, if I can get to it. There we go. The second one is an active hacking exercise. Metasploit with Armitage. You have to install Armitage they used to bundle it in with the Kali distribution. They don't do that anymore. So you have to install it, and then we start doing a little bit of playing around with the GUI interface. We take this VM, which is Metasploitable. Where did I put it? Did I close that? I don't know. No, I didn't. Okay. So this Metasploitable 2 VM, this is made by the producers of Metasploit, and it's just a Linux system that is extremely hackable. Okay. So they've introduced all sorts of vulnerabilities into it. The idea here is not that it's a challenge. The idea here is that you use that to learn how to use the Metasploit framework. Okay. So it's very hackable in multiple ways. And your goal is just to get your first hack in, and then you could try another one, then you could try another one, then you could try another one as you learn how the system works. Okay. Um, so as you get more comfortable with it, it should get easier essentially. You'll get a feel for Armitage and whether you like it. And then after, we're going to change horses and we're going to just use the Metasploit framework's command line interface. Okay. When it comes to evaluations, I don't care which one you use, honestly. But it's always good to be able to use the built-in command line tool. So I do want you to be able to do that, but I have no claims about your preferences. Okay. That's pretty much what I got for you for today. So if you're ready to go ahead and get to work, then go ahead and do that. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around and ask. And I'll kind of just be lurking in the background otherwise.